Senator, when did you first come in contact with the whole idea of the IEN? When was it first brought up?
The Idaho Education Network was brought up as a concept to us in, I think it was 2008, 2009. And it was brought, I was made aware of it when we were in the old courthouse across the street during the Capitol remodel. And the concept, as presented, was modeled after the Utah model, or that we were told, and a way to bring broadband internet service, and in particular video conferencing equipment, to schools across the state to hook up every high school so that there were more opportunities for our high school students to take classes that they might not otherwise be able to take, utilizing long-distance education over the internet, whether it was video conferencing or some other internet service.
And what was your first impression when the idea was floated past?
I thought it was a really good idea. I was worried about expense at the time because being on the budget committee, that's something that I focus on, is the cost, and then concerned about the longevity of the state's commitment, knowing that the rural areas of Idaho and in my district, we're very rural. We still have folks on dial-up even today on the internet, and that if we were to get the program started as a state, that it was important that rural areas got connectivity, but that the state was able to sustain it because our rural districts could not afford to do so.
When the program, after the legislation passed and the program started taking shape, were you comfortable with it initially?
I was very comfortable with it. I was honored to be appointed both by the pro tem of the Senate, Brent Hill, and by Superintendent Tom Luna to serve on the advisory committee. And so I have participated in the oversight committee or the advisory committee since its inception. It's been and continues to be a very exciting tool and opportunity for our kids. And so I was always very pleased about the build out, how quickly we were able to build it out, how quickly the schools began to utilize the program. And in those areas where some schools were hesitant, I was appreciative of the staff's outreach to those districts to help them learn how to use the equipment and the technology and understand the benefits that could occur.
And when you first saw the contract, did you have any questions about that or the process at the time?
You know, I'm not certain. I don't recall seeing a contract, actually, on the advisory committee. Now, that's not to say that I didn't. I could well have. But I really didn't pay attention to it. And I think that our advisory committee, my perception of our advisory committee until this last couple of years, was that our focus was more on the delivery of the service, what schools were being hooked up, how much bandwidth they were using, what the programs were that they were accessing, and the school-to-school things like calculus classes from one district to another district. Our focus was more on content and less on the nuts and bolts of contracts. The nuts and bolts that we did talk about was how many schools we had hooked up. So I think my first understanding that something could be out of line was when the lawsuits began to be filed, and we started working through those legal processes.
And going back to the whole idea of the advisory committee looking at the content, were there any concerns along the way with the content as you were looking at that?
I didn't really have any concerns about content because each district, as they became familiar with the possibilities, with their locally elected officials and their administrators and the educators, helped guide what was appropriate for their communities. So I trust our local elected school boards and our teachers and administrators to have made the right decision.
And as someone who kind of saw this process through in different capacities, how did you feel when it started coming together? Were you proud? Were you still nervous about the fiscal impact? How did you feel?
Still very much, even today, I remain proud. I think of it. I think of the Idaho Education Network as one of those pieces of my service in the state senate that I can point to and say I was able to assist in helping our students have more access to educational opportunities, and I'm very proud of that accomplishment. And I believe going into the future that we'll still be able to point to it as an achievement, that we've expanded a network out to all of our high schools. We've expanded broadband into rural communities and made it available, and I think we'll continue to see that expansion. And I am confident that history will show us that this was a bump in the road, an unfortunate bump in the road, but it was an opportunity to stop and take a deep breath and reevaluate, reassess, and then move forward.
And along those lines, how has this affected classrooms?
I think there's a couple things. One, I think it has increased the ability for rural schools like Clark Fork, very rural area. But they are nationally recognized for their scholastic achievements, and primarily that's happened because of the access that the internet has given them, the opportunity that has been provided by the Idaho Education Network and the internet and the broadband capacity to augment into their small school courses that they couldn't pick up other places. We also have students in Sandpoint that are able to take a higher level math class. We have students in Bonners Ferry and Peace River that are able to take online courses through our community colleges and get some of their community college credits done while they're still in high school. And that's replicated across the state, and that is particularly exciting, and it's a positive, I believe, for our school system.
Along those lines, we've been working with the State Department of Education to look into whether there have been any metrics collected or data collected on how good these classes are, whether the students are retaining the information with distance learning compared to in-person classes, and we're finding that there has been no data collected. Is that something you regret or you think needs to be done, or did it ever come up in conversation?
You know, that is not something that we thought about, and I guess my assumption there would be when students are taking the classes through a community college, for example, there's assessments that are done during that period or during that coursework, and the coursework that's being delivered, say the calculus class, there's assessments that are done as there would be done in a classroom to determine whether or not the student has gained proficiency. And then with our testing strategy and our K-12 systems, I think there's tools out there that clearly let us know through an assessment, through a test, how our students are doing, and whether or not that coursework is delivered electronically or in person. I guess I have confidence in both systems. Let's talk about calculus again. The student is working with a certified teacher in another school district. They've got to meet state standards. They've got to pass assessment tests, and I think that they are likely being assessed for their coursework and materials. I don't know that we have taken a step to try to correlate that to whether or not the coursework was delivered over the Idaho Education Network or the internet versus being in the school. As it pertains to a student being eligible to complete high school, they've got to pass their courses. And so I think it becomes part of that greater educational record that a student amasses during their high school career. Same thing for the college classes. Those were available even before the Idaho Education Network began. And again, those classes are assessed by those colleges, and should those students wish to pursue accreditation through those community colleges or for that college coursework, that grade's going to show up on a transcript somewhere. And so I think that the data probably is there, but it's not been tied to the use of the Idaho Education Network.
Kind of going back to when problems started popping up, at what point did you realize that something might not be right? Was it that lawsuit that you mentioned, or?
Well, I think what became concerning for me was certainly last session was a tipping point for me, when it became clear that the judicial system was not agreeing with what we were being told by the Department of Administration in terms of what the message that I felt like I got as an advisory committee member was, it'll all be okay, the judges, you know, we're right, the judge is going to agree with us, it'll be fine. And it was clear that when the judicial decisions started coming in, that it wasn't all right. And then last session, we clearly said to the Department of Administration, settle this. We want to move forward. It appears that there is validity in the claims that in the lawsuit, and we want to move forward. We want to move forward, and we are going to fund this on a short-term basis, and we want you to settle in the meantime. And then over the summer, again, I became increasingly frustrated in the advisory committee meetings, because we continued to be told, well, we're working on it, we're right, they're wrong. Very defensive posture being taken on the part of the Department of Administration and the attorneys, and then they stopped working towards settlement, and that was extremely frustrating, because it felt as though we weren't looking for a solution that would rectify the problems that the judge had clearly identified by fall, and that we were at the same time as legislative body being pushed to the cliff that we reached today.
When you first officially heard there was a problem, what went through your head and how did you feel?
Well, I again was concerned about the contracting process and about the parent, what the judge identified as inappropriate contract process, and I felt like we needed to fix it. I tend to be a fix it and fix it fast. I've learned as I get older that sometimes you got to be a little more patient. But my patience ran out this fall when the judge clearly said this contract is void.
Do you think this should have ended up in court?
You know, it's always easy to be the armchair quarterback. I was not on the front line, so to speak, in the contract negotiations, and my role as an advisory committee member was an advisory committee. I think in hindsight, looking at the statute for the advisory committee, we certainly have a little more oversight responsibilities that we could have exerted, perhaps, that we should have in hindsight as a legislative body. But I, as a legislator, a part-time legislator, put my trust in the Department of Administration. And I feel as though when the judge clearly said, you've got a problem, instead of digging in, we should have said, okay, we're going to settle and we're going to move forward.
Moving forward, do you think the legislature should continue to put trust in the Department of Administration?
I think that the legislature needs to evaluate the laws, our contracting laws. I think we need to take a hard look at those. I think that it's been suggested that we have an interim committee that really rolls up its sleeves. The interim committee process, as you know, provides our citizens' legislature the opportunity to spend more time on thorny issues, and I think this is very clearly an opportunity for us to take a hard look at our contract process. And I think we need to do that.
what do you think should happen? How should the state handle both, not just the contracts, but the broadband issue in schools?
Well, I think clearly we made a step today. Our goal as a legislature is to try, to the degree possible, to not disrupt the service, the broadband service. We have found out through this time that while video conferencing equipment's not being used maybe so much, certainly the broadband service is being used, and it's being used very widely and very heavily. And I think part of that's an evolution of technology. Our technology today is much different than it was when we started down this path. Our cell phones have cameras where we can chat with people. We have Snapchat. It's different today. And I think, again, this is an opportunity for us to take a look at broadband delivery to Idahoans for not only education, but for the opportunity that broadband offers for commerce and for communication.
What do you think will happen?
So I think that in my crystal ball, my hope is that we, again, we make sure that our contracting process is proper, that there are safeguards in place to make sure that we do our contracting process appropriately and legally, and there's a check and balance system, and that we make hooking up our education system to broadband a priority, but also look at the broader opportunity for expanding broadband across the state, particularly in our underserved rural areas where they still have dial-up.
Is the answer more local control, maybe? I mean, one of the things that we've heard is that the schools are using this differently, and they have different needs, and they have different situations as far as their connectivity. Might that be part of the solution?
I think we'll get to see very clearly within the next month how that plays out. I still think the state has a role to play, because I think the concept being that, and hearing from my districts, they were able to secure broadband service for much less than they're going to be able to secure it now on their own, and that the state still has a role to play in aggregating that business and perhaps getting it less expensively in some areas of the state. That's not true across the board, apparently, but there are some areas in the state where purchasing that service under a state system is going to be less expensive and better. But that being said, I think also we need to allow our local school districts to determine what it is that works best for them. And in a way, they've kind of done that, where the video conference equipment hasn't been used as much as some would have thought. They self-selected what programs, what access work best for them, and we need to trust that.
One last question. Is all of that enough to gain back the trust of the local school districts and superintendents?
You know, I hope so. I think as a legislature, we've been, especially within the last few months, we've worked really hard to communicate with the local districts that the legislature was trying to chart a path forward that left the districts as whole as possible. And I'm hoping that the districts see that. I think early last fall and earlier in this session, school districts were being led to believe that the legislature somehow wanted to kill the IEN. And I think part of that was bad information. For whatever reason, those districts were getting bad information, because I don't think there's a legislator in this building that wanted to kill the IEN. They just wanted to make sure that the contract and the process was legal, and I think we'll continue to see that commitment. When we look at what the school districts have the unfortunate task to do over the next couple of weeks, I think that we have to trust that and understand that each school district, or most of our school districts, at least the ones I'm most familiar with in my district, they each have technology directors. And when you talk to those people, the technology directors, they know their services, they know the person and the company that's brought the pipe into their buildings and brought them onto the network, and they have good relationships with them. They also contract, the school districts contract regularly for a variety of services. And so I have confidence in them and in the local elected school boards, and also have confidence in the State Department of Education. I think we have good people there that are also knowledgeable about contracts. I think the new superintendent, Sherry Ibarra, has stepped up to the plate with her staff, Will Goodman, who's also very knowledgeable. And I think where those districts that may not have that hard set of skills, if they contact the Department of Education, that they'll be able to get the help that they need.